Good, we've just gone 12 o'clock. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Chris Andrews. I'm dialing in from Cape Town from the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. I'd like to welcome you to this launch and online discussion of the latest NSI Government in Numbers paper titled Retiring the 1994 Generation, the Senior Management Service. We're very excited to welcome you and our authors as well as panelists in discussing the very interesting content here and the relevance it has for South Africa's democracy. I'd like to briefly introduce Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, myself, NSI, and the speakers. So my name is Chris Andrews. I'm with the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung in Cape Town, South Africa. Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung is a German political foundation that supports democracy internationally. In particular, we are interested in promoting multi-party democracy, the rule of law, and the social market economy. Today, we're particularly interested in good governance, and we're excited to be able to support our good partners, the New South Institute. To briefly introduce the New South Institute, the NSI focuses on understanding and reforming the inner workings of government in fragile democracies. Through rigorous evidence-based research and policy engagement, its work is rooted in accountability, identifying the causes of institutional failure, strengthening oversight, and supporting reforms that improve the performance of the state. I'd like to mention that the NSI was named by OnThink think tanks as one of the world's think tanks to watch in 2025. We are in good hands. So much to the hosts of today. May I introduce you the speakers? I'll begin with Dr. Ivor Chipkin, the co-founder and director of the New South Institute. He's a political analyst, author, a public intellectual, working on state formation, governance, and democracy in South Africa. He previously led the Public Affairs Research Institute, PARI, at the Universities of the Witwatersrand and Cape Town for over a decade. He was trained at the École Normale Supérieure in France and is a former Oppenheimer Fellow at Oxford University. Following on, I'd like to introduce Vinothan Naidoo, Associate Professor of Public Policy and Administration at University of Cape Town. Vinothan will be giving us our response to the paper. He has 25 years of experience as a lecturer, research practitioner, and policy analyst in the field of public administration and management. He's written extensively on public sector reform in South Africa for both academic and public audiences, including issues such as political administrative relations, policy coordination, structural change, and anti-corruption enforcement. We couldn't have asked for a better respondent. Prof. Naidoo, thank you so much for the opportunity of having you on this call. Finally, and of course most importantly in this case as well, is our expert Yoliswa Makhasi. Yoliswa is an accomplished strategic leader and policy expert with extensive experience in public sector governance, strategic leadership, and transformational change. She was a research fellow and head of the Public Service Reform Program at the New South Institute, previously served as the DG, the Director General of the Department of Public Service and Administration, and as head of the Department for Community Safety in Gauteng Provincial Government. We have with us somebody with an excellent eye for what goes on inside of government. Yoliswa, we'd like to recognize you for your visionary leadership and your strategic oversight and your commitment to fostering impactful change. We are in wonderfully good hands. I am looking forward to the next hour in your company. And to begin, I'd like to ask Ivor to please take the word to introduce the series of papers and to dive into its content. Over to you, Ivor. Thank you.
Kristen, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I see we have some people who have joined us, so let's jump into it. So this is the second paper in a series of papers, well, perhaps the third paper, but it follows on very closely to the first paper, which was looking at the job profile of the public service, the demographic character of the public service. And in the last paper, what we found was, and I'll tell you the methodology in a moment, I'll discuss it in a moment, we found that generally speaking, the South African public service was aging, and the generation that had entered the public service or who had remained in the public service at 1994 was essentially reaching retirement age. And there were both risks involved with that, but also huge opportunities to start bringing in young people into the public service in their tens of thousands. I know there's very high unemployment, a huge opportunity, a great need to bring in young people into the public service. So that was the finding of the first report, which we called Retiring the 1994 Generation. In this report, we've followed that report, but we focus specifically on the leadership of the public service. So we're looking at the senior management service. And here the results are, like the first results, also show a tremendous aging of the public service. Again, an echelon or a cohort of people that are essentially entering retirement age, in some cases very, very soon, like in education, we'll see in a moment, are within 5 years of retirement. And what that means is not so much an opportunity, but a great risk going forward, because many of our departments are going very soon to be largely without leaders. And we're going to think a little bit about what that means in the context of, and this is what I want to talk to you before we get into the details of the paper, the general context. And the general context is, unlike in the hearings of the Makhasi Commission, is very, very, lots of gloomy, but rather optimistic. And I'm very excited about the current moment, because we have to think about the character of the public service, the demographics of the public service, the skills in the public service, the profile of public service in relationship to some tremendous progressive reform momentum. And I think this is hugely important to frame this conversation in. South Africa is in the midst of a tremendous period of fundamental structural reform of the public service, much of it, I think, very progressive and very, very positive. So perhaps let me open up with a few more remarks in that regard. As I've said before on other occasions, and as I've written, but it's worth repeating, in 1994, when the African National Congress came to power, it came to power in and through a negotiated settlement, which had guaranteed for apartheid-era public servants, both within historically white South Africa and also in the Bantustans, had guaranteed that they would retain their jobs and, of course, their pensions in the post-apartheid dispensation. So tens of thousands of apartheid-era public servants remained in their positions transition. For many in the ANC, this was deeply concerning. And the main reason is, we can understand, they were very worried that an apartheid-era public service simply did not have the skills or the disposition to implement ANC policies in the post-1994 period. The ANC came into power on the back of what it hoped to be a radical project of transformation. We'll remember the Reconstruction and Development Program, this idea that the state should be used as a fundamental instigator or trigger of development, and that the public administration would play a key role in that regard. The African National Congress, of course, deeply concerned that an apartheid-era public service simply would not implement its radical policies. Even worse, Thabo Mbeki was worried that the public service of the time would be a source of counter-revolution. And as a result, there was deep concern that the ANC could not trust the existing civil service. And as a result, in 1994, the ANC developed a workaround in a piece of legislation, a foundational legislation from 1994, even prior to the Constitution of 1996, we get a sense of how important it was, which was the Public Service Act. And in particular, in Section 3 of the Public Service Act, they introduced some clauses which have had massive consequences for the history of post-apartheid South Africa, consequences which I don't think we've adequately thought about. Vinothan Naidoo has done some important work in this regard, one of the earliest people to draw attention to it. Yoliswa Makhasi, of course, has spent a lot of her career focused on it, but in the academic world and in the research world, I don't think we understand or have adequately appreciated the consequences and the significance of Clause 3, Section 3 of the Public Service Act. Because in that section and in those clauses, the African National Congress granted to politicians, to the president, to ministers at the national level, and to ministers at provincial level, MECs, lots and lots of fundamental administrative powers, and key ones in particular, the key one, powers of recruitment. So from 1994, ministers at national, provincial level had all powers over human resource management, including over recruitment. So all our public services in South Africa are essentially political appointments appointed through a political process, unless ministers choose to delegate those functions to director generals or heads of department. We'll come to that in a moment. So that's the one area. Operational decisions, including minor operational decisions, including things like even the choice of IT systems for departments, again, were made political responsibilities. So many fundamental administrative tasks were granted to not director generals and heads of department, but fundamentally to our politicians. Again, the idea being that the ANC would like politicians to remain in political control of the departments because they didn't trust apartheid-era public servants. And if that made sense in the first years of the transition, we recall 1998, there was a presidential review, and as early as 1998, the presidential review was concerned about this allocation of powers and was already suggesting that there was time to loosen them or to change them altogether. So very early on in the transition, official reports were beginning to realize that this was a problem. Nonetheless, it wasn't changed, and we've had that dispensation until 2026, when the Public Service Amendment Act was passed in April this year. So an extraordinary achievement, I believe, an extraordinary historical moment, which has undone or begin to reform the decisions made in 1994. And essentially what the Public Service Amendment Act does is it takes those administrative powers, takes them from politicians, and it gives them now to heads of departments in government departments, to director generals and to heads of department. So until now, just to repeat, if you're a director general and you've entered your office, you've had no original powers except through the PFMA, so some financial responsibilities, but you've had no real administrative powers to do your jobs. You couldn't recruit people and you couldn't make operational decisions inside your departments unless a minister delegated those powers to you, and often waiting powers was a little bit like waiting for Godot. They never came, or there was tremendous an embattled situation or tremendous amount of conflict between ministers and DGs over the exercise of those powers. And as Yoliswa will know and continue over and over again, sometimes those were granted to director generals, sometimes those powers were withdrawn from director generals, or sometimes only an aspect of the power was granted and not the full power. So lots of conflict around the exercise and the allocation of those powers. I argue, and myself, and Vino's written this as well, and other academics have written in the space, that I regard that this contestation and this struggle over powers in departments has been one of the major struggles affecting the performance of the public service over the last 30 years. I also think it's been one of the major sources of corruption and state and opportunities for what we called in South Africa state capture. So the reform that has just happened in 2026 in April, I think, is of great historical importance. It brings South Africa in line with reforms happening on the African continent generally, in Kenya, in Ghana, in Nigeria, of course in Rwanda as well. Tremendously powerful moves to professionalize public administrations in those countries. And more broadly, it brings South Africa in line with some of the developments which have happened globally. Asian ties, it goes after the end of the Second World War, when there were very strong steps to rationalize post-war administrations. In the United States, this period of rationalization had started at the end of the 19th century in the Hamilton Act, introduced by the first administration of first administration in the 1900s after the Second World War. I think the Pendleton Act of 1883 is very similar to the Public Service Amendment Act in 2026. So I think very important things happening in South Africa. I don't think we always give credit to the scale of changes which are beginning to happen in South Africa, and I think it's an important story to tell over and above the other stories of gloom and profound crisis which are of the South African media. So that's the broad context. It's within that context that NSI secured, with Yoliswa's assistance, thank you very much, Yoliswa, an MOU, a Memorandum of Agreement with the Department of Public Service Administration to access human resources data from government on the character of the public service. So in South Africa, that data is called PERSAL, PERSAL data, it's a large personal management system. There are criticisms of that system. There are criticisms of the reliability of that data, which we have to acknowledge. We have been working on a data from about the last 20 years for all departments at national and provincial government level. I must emphasize this. We do not have, PERSAL doesn't cover the local government, so none of this data speaks to local government, and maybe we can talk about that in the course of our discussion about how this, if some of these trends relate to local government as well. Gut instinct is that they do, but nonetheless, this report is based exclusively on the findings in provincial and national governments. So PERSAL data, this is a data set of about the last 20 years. We believe that it's more or less reliable. But I do have to bring out some concerns. When we've tried to triangulate this data with departmental reports, we've sometimes found anomalies, inexplicable anomalies, which cast doubt on one of those sources of data. So, for example, when we looked at the police and we tried to triangulate some of these findings with reports from annual reports in the South African police, we found very different numbers. They weren't even approximately close to each other. Trends suggested in the police report data is different to what comes out of PERSAL, and I do want to highlight that. We have to think about what that means for ability of this analysis going forward. Somewhere along the line, I suspect that the PERSAL data is more reliable than the annual reports of departments. I'm speaking, though, of something very in particular. The PERSAL data has also got geographic location signatures on all public servants. We use that data to try and analyze the spatial configurations or spatial changes in the public service, and that data doesn't align with the data coming out of the South African Police Service regards to where their policemen are located and where they're stationed. So there's a misalignment there. I don't know if it speaks to broader problems or misalignments in the data, but I do want to signal that. All right. So this specific report, as I've said going at the beginning, follows from an initial report on the retiring of the public on the aging of the public service as a whole. And what we've done here is we've looked specifically at the senior management service, this key cohort established in around 1999, 2000. The idea being that the senior management service would be a leadership core for the public service. They would be freed up from all sorts of bureaucratic regulation to be able to innovate inside their departments, to show leadership in their departments. So an incredibly important innovation following trends in the new public management. This idea that we don't want running departments, rule followers focused specifically on internal processes. We wanted a cohort modeled on business leaders or business managers who would be focusing on outcomes and outputs and would develop systems and processes in order to achieve those outputs and those outcomes. And on that basis, given lots of discretion in the way in which they would run their office. Of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, this process was short-circuited in South Africa by the fact that ministers held on to those administrative powers through the Public Service Act. Yes, an incredibly important about get things going forward. I think we're going to have to really work on the senior management service. Let me then quickly dive into the report. It's a shortish report, but there are a couple of very important trends I think to identify. Delaney, can we move on to the slides? So I think this is what's really interesting. So the mean average of the SMS is now between 53 and 55 years old across all sectors, national and provincial governments. These are the generals, and what you can see is an aging of the senior management service from when we first have data, which is around 2010. So in 2010, the mean age is around late 40s, 47, and now it is in the early 50s. So what you've got now is essentially a senior management who are readying themselves for retirement. And as Yoliswa has made the point several times, heard or given and has written as well, in that retirement frame, your focus really is on preservation and remaining in your position because you're thinking now of your pension, and you're not really in a stage of innovation and focusing on service delivery. So we have at the leadership of the public service a generation of people who are readying themselves for retirement, and I think their focus therefore is probably on preparing themselves for a post-work life, or a post public service life. Can we move on? Next slide, Delaney. You see this very dramatically when we compare it relative to other age cohorts. So in 2008, we see that those over the age of 50, which is the orange tab, the orange part of the line, is below 40%, 36.5%, and in 2024, it's almost 80% of the senior management service. What is especially concerning is a huge decline in the younger cohort, and especially of people under 40. Essentially, what this means is that as the public service senior management is retiring, it's not generating their replacements. So they are not young people or younger people coming rising up through the ranks of departments into the senior management who are ready to take over the positions of those retiring. Essentially, what is happening is that the cohort as a whole is aging without bringing in fresh young blood into departments. So when these people retire, there essentially are not people younger than them or much younger than them to replace them. I think this is generally speaking a very concerning trend. Can we move over? So when we look at this in health, we see the same trend in the Department of Health amongst teachers and amongst the senior manager. When we looked at the nurses in the public service, we saw extraordinary the same process. Our nurses are aging, like our teachers. We'll come to that in a moment. And amongst the senior managers, the same profile, not as acute as the general trend nationally. Next slide, please. Education, it's the same trend, the general aging of the senior management in education. And here we think it's acute. Mean age of the education SMS is the oldest cadre analyzed. Over 80% of the education senior managers are over 50. 30 to 33% of teachers are over 50, the layer they manage. So a substantial age difference between senior managers and the average age of teachers. One. We need to contrast this. So there's a general process of aging of the public service. We also have to recognize that this is in the context of some really dramatic achievements around the racial transformation of the public service. So African representation at the national SMS was just over 50% in 2008. It's now over 70%. Whereas white representation of senior managers has dropped from just over 30% in 2008 to mere 13%. So you've had very successful racial transformation, demographic transformation of the public service. So in that regard, huge gains around representativity and redress in terms of the racial profile. But what it's come at the expense of, I think, is a lack of attention to the age of public servants. So essentially what we've had over the last 30 years is a very successful attempt to change the racial character and the demographic character of the public service, but I think we've neglected other aspects of aspects of the public service, like, for example, the age of the public service. Another slide. We see it very dramatically here. African share of the health SMS. This is the health department now, from 44% in 2010 to nearly 80% in 2020. African share of education, SMS, is 66% in 2004, and it's nearly almost 80% in 2024. So you've had, again, as the demographic of the department has changed, but especially acute at the senior management level. Next slide, Delani. So, and this is where I want to end, and some final remarks. So I think we can definitely see that in terms of transformation, the demographic change of the public service, enormous achievements have been made over the last 30 years. What has not been adequately considered, though, or factored in, is the age of public servants, and I think this is now not a crisis, but it's both a challenge and a huge opportunity. South Africa has acute youth unemployment. I see the latest figures of our youth unemployment has risen even further, which brings it close to 50% of young people are without a job and not in education. And yet our public service is desperately needing young people at all levels. So I think there is a huge opportunity, not just filling job quotas, but because there's a huge challenge now of an aging public service, of many public servants at all levels entering retirement, to bring young people into the public service, both as a transformational goal, but also as a key need of the public service itself to begin the next step of transformation. And this is really where I want to end. There are huge reforms which South Africa is currently undertaking around professionalizing and rationalizing the public service. One of its key goals, I think, is to better establish a public service which is more autonomous relative to into the political class as a whole, a public service that is more professional, which is in the language of the professionalization framework, and we could further use that language, which is more merit-based, bringing people into the public service that both have the skills, have the temperament, have the ethical orientation to serve a public administration which is relatively autonomous and relatively neutral compared to political parties, as opposed to political parties and the political class. This is precisely what we need in South Africa, I strongly believe. So the opportunity now, as this generation begins to retire and phase out of the public service, is to bring in new young people into the public service and train them on the basis of different kinds of values of public service. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity coinciding with the huge reforms which South Africa is currently undertaking in the space of government transformation and government change, to generate and begin to train a new generation of public servants with a different ethos and a different orientation to their jobs and to the political class more generally. Public servants that can stand up to politicians and say no. Public servants that realize that their fundamental responsibilities to the policies of the party of the day, not to individual politicians or to networks of politicians. Their responsibilities are to the law and to the mandates of those departments, and their responsibilities are to the Constitution. And I think this is now an opportunity to begin to train and prepare this new generation going forward. On that note, thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Ivor. A wonderful presentation on a wonderful paper. Congratulate the NSI again on it. And what a great opportunity for South Africa to change its trajectory with a whole new set of SMS leaders. Now, may I turn over to our peer review opportunity? Vino, dialing in from UCT, you've had a look at the paper. What were your thoughts? What is your feedback for the authors?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, everybody. I'm going to try to be quick. I have read the report, made some notes. The first thing I just want to highlight is the report asks the question, who is the 1994 SMS generation? And I've always been a bit cautious about painting an entire generation of senior managers with the same brush, who, and I'm paraphrasing here, prize loyalty to the ruling party more often than professional merit. I think we've had different waves of deployment, and I think the mix of political allegiances and objectively verifiable merit skills is more complex. However, I do agree that we need to make the recruitment and appointment of senior public servants, senior managers, much more rigorous and transparent. The second thing, just looking at the national SMS age distribution, and it was quite dramatic, as Ivor has spoken to, the dramatic increase, the dramatic aging. there was a noticeable shrinking of the 40 to 49 pool of mid-career managers versus a significant expansion in the over 50s. And it does pose the question: what is driving the exit of mid-career, seemingly exit of mid-career officials, given that there has only been a 17% increase in the overall size of the SMS? One thing I wanted to ask the authors is how they decided on the age bands, which define the distribution. Would adjusting the age bands affect the way the data is distributed? For example, under 40, 40 to 46, 47 to 54, 55 and over. So, was it just the case that you worked with a general distribution of the data and then created the categories according to that? Would adjusting the age bands tell us anything different? Certainly for the future modeling that you want to do. The thing that really jumped out for me about the SMS profile, the senior management profile in the health sector, was the significant reduction in the numbers of senior managers in national and provincial departments. You recorded 1,455 in 2009, all the way down to 693 in 2024. And you juxtapose that with, there's a much less pronounced expansion in the over 50 group of senior managers in health. And I'm just wondering if that's a reason to be a little bit optimistic, given the depletion of the overall number of senior managers in health. Should we desire an older cohort of senior managers in what is a technically complex field, such as public health, and the value of the accumulation of institutional and clinical knowledge? And is there perhaps more reason to be optimistic that the 40 to 49s will replenish and could have take their seat at the leadership desk? For education, these figures were more alarming, and I agree with Ivor there. But I would like to know if we have figures that tell us if there has been a similar reduction in the overall number of senior managers in the education sector, national and provincial departments. Certainly, there's a more pronounced squeezing of the younger cohort of senior managers and the expansion of an older cohort. And this is worrying, given how logistically significant the scope of supervisory oversight is in the education sector. If we don't have a large enough number of senior managers to take the place of an aging senior management education core, it's going to make performing oversight over a large network of schools as well as provincial departments that much more difficult. Resignation is something that I think Ivor didn't mention, but I found some really interesting things to pick up on when it comes to the resignation rate. So the report says that there was a significant spike in the number of senior managers who resigned in 2022, and then it sort of came down quite a bit the following year and sort of stabilized. And and the report, I think, is really nice and nuanced about what could have led to that number of resignations. The answer is not really clear. So, it might just be a blip. It wasn't an election year. It was 3 years after President Ramaphosa's first full administration came into being. So it might just be an acceleration of voluntary attrition. But as Ivor kind of pointed out too, the report points out, and what Ivor mentioned around the framework for professionalizing the public service, there's been a significant increase in disciplinary cases, which may have played a role in some of these officials preemptively resigning. And there's also a stricter employment regime which is being introduced by the National School of Government's professionalization framework, especially around the validation of qualifications. So, it might be the case that the system is really trying to rid itself of dead wood, so to speak. And the fact that there was only a spike in that year and the number of resignations came down again in the following 2 years and seems to have stabilized at a higher plateau, it might be cause for optimism about a more sort of normalized process of exit or resignation. The last thing I just wanted to throw into the mix, and these are just suggestions for future research, I think it would help to qualify the age analysis that you've done here by disaggregating it by level of SMS. So we've got various levels within the senior management category, director all the way up to director general, pay classes 13 to 16. So I would like to know if this demographic pattern holds at all of those levels kind of consistently. So the aggregation assumes, which is in the report, a kind of orderly internal replenishment within the ranks, which might not actually hold for each individual rank within the SMS. A second suggestion, I'd love to see a breakdown by department. I've done previous work deconstructing the internal organizational structure of government departments, including lines of accountability, span of control that managers have, operational profile of departments. So are they more service delivery heavy or more policy or involved in more sort of policy development? And I think a demographic profile of the senior leadership of individual departments can tell us some really interesting and more nuanced, give us a more nuanced picture of how this aging senior management cohort is likely to, or the implications of it for departmental operations. And I think finally, I would love to see a disaggregated breakdown of all senior managers in provincial departments, not just in health and education, to see what that demographic picture looks like. And the reason for that is that the vast majority of senior managers are employed in provincial departments, and not just in health and education, although they take up the bulk. Some of my previous research with colleagues noted a significant increase in middle managers employed in provincial departments in past years, which has actually outstripped any gains we've had in frontline personnel. And I'm just curious to see if we've seen any sort of feeding through of this, or if we do see any feeding through of this at the senior management ranks. So let me just stop there, Christian. But thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Vinothan. Those are very useful ideas of peeking further under the hood of the data, and a couple of the strange anomalies that we find as well that just invite us to think more about the trends that we are seeing. May I suggest, Ivor, I hope you've been taking notes, that we give you a right of reply later on, but that we rather turn the word over to Yoliswa now, because I think that embedding the conversation of the SMS, the senior management service, into the wider public service aging is worthwhile doing, and understanding the opportunity for renewal in the wider context of the public service. So, Yoliswa, I would like to ask if you could give us maybe 5 minutes, 6 minutes on the wider frame of what's happening in the public service.
Christian, Yoliswa is going to feel really done out. You originally gave her 8 minutes. Now you've reduced. She lost another 2 minutes.
Yeah, but she's a senior professional.
I don't know if that request of reducing by further 2 minutes, but let me try. I just did a brief presentation, and I'm just going to go through it, because I was just tying back the two reports and just identifying some of the issues that I think are critical in going forward. And good afternoon to everybody who's connected. I hope you can hear me clearly. The first point for me, I'm not sure if my camera is on. Oh yeah, it is.
Yes,
the first point for me really is that we are moving from, what these two reports are showing us is that we are moving from an aging public service to a professionalized, we want to move to a professionalized next generation of public service leadership. And just, I brought back Ivor spoke a lot about the first report as well that we issued in 2025 at NSI. So that report mainly looked at what happens when an aging public service retires. And now what happens when the post-1994 senior leadership generation retires? And I think it's very important, the latest report that has been issued, it's focusing on senior leadership. So we have to move from demographics to really leadership and institutional capability, because a lot of that capability also resides in that senior leadership. And I'm presenting that, for me, professionalizing the public service is the bridge between the two. Kind of.
Yoliswa, may I interrupt for a second?
Yes.
Would you mind putting it onto presentation mode at the bottom, just so it's easier to read?
Sorry so much.
That's perfect.
So,
Thank you.
So the diagnosis has been made in terms of the May 2025 report. Of course, we sit at the risk of losing skills, experience, and institutional memory as people exit, and therefore we can't postpone making the system work better. The current report, I think for me, what is important is that we're talking about leadership now and leadership succession. And also the fact that the SMS level, it becomes a critical point of vulnerability. And the retirement is not a problem, but the issue is the pipeline that's ready to come in as people retire, because it's a natural attrition. People are going to retire when the time comes. I think that I'll send the presentation, colleagues can read for themselves. I just want to highlight a little bit. I've raised the issue of the central argument. Retirement is not the problem, and unprepared transition is the problem. And the question is not simply who replaces the 1994 generation. The deeper question is what kind of leadership will replace the 1994 generation. And so some of the pointers on what that next generation should look like: professionally competent and constitutionally grounded, ethical, accountable, and values-driven, politically astute without being politically captured. This is quite important. We need a generation of leaders who are going to be able to navigate the politics and support the public representatives to deliver without themselves being too much entangled in the political space as the leaders of in administration. If you think about public administration as a system, you definitely need people who are systems thinkers, so that be able to connect with all the systems, with all the components of the system, and ensure that the system is working. Because you have one part of the system where you have the political, the public representatives sitting. You have one part of the system where you have the officials themselves sitting, but you also have people who must receive the service, and you cannot wish those people away from the system because they are voters, they have an input in the system itself. So from a systems thinking, how do you then ensure that all these various components are in alignment and are working together towards creating value for members of the public is very important. Obviously, the skills of evidence and data-driven, which is also a skill that is not very prominent in the public service broadly. There may be pockets where the skill is, but it's not a given that that skill is available in all the institutions, in all the departments, nationally and yet government handles so much data, and people in most instances don't know what to do with the data. Capable of leading through complexity, partnerships, and coalitions. We have coalitions government in municipalities. We have a government of national unity. It looks like the future is going to look like that. So the capability to leading through complexity is very important, and being digitally capable and future oriented. So this is the kind of a public servant, in my view, that we're looking at. And also professionalization becomes more than training, because I think one of our challenges is that we have looked at professionalization more as an HR intervention, which is always rested at training. But if you think about the entire system, we have to have a conversation about also professionalization, including the public representatives. And we have to think of professionalization broader than just training or capacity building. Obviously, it's merit. It talks to recruitment must be merit-based. And I heard Vino already saying that there could be spin-offs of some of the work that is being done in the system to strengthen recruitment and to strengthen the merit, where people who are not meeting requirements are being rejected from the system. Induction must be targeted. There must be leadership development that is targeted. There must be professional standards and accountability that are very clear and known by everybody. The performance system currently in the public sector, or in the public service specifically, is still underperforming. It could be improved and perform at a better level. Career progression, something we don't do in government. We don't do deliberate succession. And I think, again, it's a very narrow interpretation of the Constitution around fairness and etc. I think that there could still be a transparent system that encourages succession in the public service. When in the past I've asked about these things, I was told that it's not allowed because the Constitution requires everybody to be treated fairly and transparently. In hindsight, I do think that there could be a narrow interpretation. There's something could be done around that. And then an institutional culture that is really embedded in ethics and ethical leadership and etc. Knowledge transfer is very important to ensure intergenerational continuity. We're talking now about who next must come in. So from an intergenerational continuity is very important. What I've seen in the public service happens is that we even retain people who should be on retirement because we are hanging on to institutional knowledge. And yet, because we may not have sufficient mechanisms to ensure transfer of information to those who are being left in the system. And I think it's an issue that matters. And professionalization must cover the entire leadership life cycle, because leadership is very effective. Leadership and accountability is very critical, and a functional political administrative interface. I'll just touch a little bit a few of these, and then I'm sure my time is up if it's not close to being up. But I just want to highlight a few things about the political administrative interface. That it is a fact that democratic governments require political leadership. Professional administration requires competence, integrity, and institutional space to operate. Political leadership determines policy priorities and provides democratic direction. Administrative leadership provides professional advice and implements lawful policies. So professionalization should strengthen and not undermine democratic accountability. Because every time we speak about professionalizing the public service, about delegating roles and responsibilities, I think the fear is around undermining of democratic accountability as well. And officials are there to support politicians and to drive implementation. And it's very important that we are clear about that. In building the pipeline before the vacancies, I think that it's important to identify high potential future senior managers, DGs or HODs, that high potential employees that can be nurtured and channeled into a pipeline for those responsibilities, and create structured leadership pathways in the system, provide mentoring, coaching, and cross-government exposure. Internalize that in the system, institutionalize it, build it in the system. So you don't get appointed as a director and you are in one department for 20 years. If you are so good to stay for so long, why are you not circulating amongst different departments? Why are you not gaining experience or influencing performance in other departments? Build policy, financial, and implementation and strategic capabilities. In my research, I'm currently doing, the issue of implementation of public policies in South Africa is a big issue that we need to give attention to, because we do not implement our policies fully. There's a lot of challenges around effective implementation. Transfer institutional memory deliberately. We must be deliberate about transferring information. So leaders don't sit with information and hang on to information because they believe it's their power. It's even an effective power when it's transferred and shared with others. And succession for me is also a continuous capacity building problem. We don't only do it as emergency. I'm going to jump that, but I think, Ivor, you would have an interest in this, because some of the issues for me that are coming in terms of the reform agenda, definitely the issue of democratic renewal is important. The issue of leadership renewal is important. Professionalization, institutional capability, better policy implementation, and public value. We must not forget why we are there as public servants. It's for public value. And the three questions as I close, I think we need to answer repeatedly is, who are we preparing to lead the state after the 1994 generation that is exiting? What professional standards should define that generation? and what institutional reforms are necessary to ensure they actually lead professionally. There's a lot of reforms, institutional reforms that are taking place, but I think that they do need to be pulled together so that we don't lose the opportunity. The May 2025 report told us the public service is aging. The current report told us that its leadership is equally aging and approaching a serious generational transition that is linked to retirement. The danger is not retirement itself. The danger is entering that transition without a deliberate professional leadership pipeline. The opportunity is to build the next generation of professional public leaders. And I do think that we must not miss that opportunity as the sector and people who are interested in the sector and as a society at large, because the public servants are there, or the public sector has a critical role of serving, of providing services to society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yoliswa. That was a real tour de force. I ask, would you please make your PowerPoint available after the
Certainly,
event as well? Because that was some heady stuff. It was very distilled, a master's thesis in a sentence repeatedly. So I think there were some really useful items there. What I didn't see was something about how we've never had as many well-qualified younger people in the country. And that puts us in a much better position than we were in 1994 or in the 1990s to find the right kind of people and to change the institutional culture of the civil service. So can I suggest, Ivor, I hand back to you with your right to reply, both to and to Yoliswa and your further thoughts. And I'll give you maybe, let's say, 4 minutes, and then I will pull some questions from the chat.
Yeah, sure. And I'm not going to. Generally very useful comments. I'm not going to take them as a kind of a review. I just points of discussion, and I think there are a couple here which Vino raised and Yoliswa also raises, and that is the tremendous opportunity in the current moment. And I think it's very important that this is exactly the moment to be surrendering to cliches and to crude stereotypes. And to the extent that the paper is, we need to withdraw that immediately. There is no suggestion that somehow the existing generation of public servants includes people that are generally beyond the pale in terms of their skills or their ethical attitudes. There are thousands, that I've said over and over again, thousands and thousands of extraordinarily talented people in the South African public service who have been constrained by a political environment that has largely bound their hands inside departments. So part of these reforms is, if you like, it's freeing many talented people, and I think that already is going to be a huge opportunity. So the reform in and of itself, I think, is very progressive, because essentially what it does is it frees the hands or unties the hands of people in departments who are talented, experienced, and who want to do well in their jobs. But I also think, so there are lots of good people. I think that increasing the number of the second point is that the increase in the number of disciplinary events, which the report mentions, and I think which Vino brought attention to, is I do think it's a sign of departments beginning to exercise their professional prerogatives around and disciplining non-performers in departments, those who've been getting away for years with non-performance, who have faced a generally lax disciplinary environment, are now beginning to feel an environment that is beginning to tighten, I think, and that I think is what those figures show. So talented, experienced public servants are being potentially freed up to do their jobs more effectively in an environment that is beginning to require better performance in their jobs. I think these are very, very important, and these are very progressive changes over and above the opportunities and the challenges of bringing in new people. So, raised a whole range of sort of questions going forward around breakdown by department and around provincial departments more generally. And yes, I think that's work which we'll be able to share. I want to touch on something in this conversation which Yoliswa's made, and I think she's raised something very, very important. I'd be interested to hear what Vino thinks of this, and I think Vino and I are probably aligned on this, although I'd be interested to hear. which and Yoliswa's term is a very, very useful one. I'm just trying to find it. She talked about we need public servants which are politically astute. In other words, the idea is not public servants that are somehow professionally independent or neutral and somehow cut off from politicians, but being politically astute. And we want to think a little bit about what that means. There's this idea that a high-performing public service is one that is somehow politically neutral. I don't know where that term comes from, but there's this understanding that they're simply professional, that they simply focus on the technical day-to-day aspects of their job and try to do it as well as they can in a best case scenario. That is absolutely not what is required, and that is absolutely not a recipe for a high-performing public service. What we absolutely want are public servants who are politically aligned, and they are aligned with South Africa's constitutional values in the first place. And secondly, to the extent that there's a government in power, they are aligned to the policies of that government. And that is very, very important. We need a public service that do not substitute for the government of the day their own views or the views of private networks or business networks. That they are partisan to the political policies of the party in power of the day. So they're absolutely not neutral. They are certainly not independent. They need to be aligned to the policies of the party of the day. Even if they personally do not agree with those policies, they need to implement them as best as they can. And in that sense, we do want a class of public servants that are politically aligned. There is a large, long-going debate within public administration and public service scholars around the merits of what is sometimes called a public service system as opposed to a patrimonial system. I think some of the scholarship suggests that debate as an either-or is a false debate. That patrimonialism has a very bad reputation. Patronage has a very bad reputation, but if you look at the work of Peter Evans, for example, the notions of embedded autonomy, what he's calling for is a reconciliation with a professional merit-based system with aspects of patronage and aspects of patrimonialism. Civil servants that are politically connected and within political relationships. I think that's correct. In the South African context, this idea that we can have public servants that do not also have relationships with politicians, I think is a non-starter debate. We as the NSI are about to release what we're calling a white paper. It's not really a white paper, a report on the appointment of DGs. It's one of the big questions which is unanswered and not dealt with in the Public Service Amendment Act. How do we appoint DGs going forward? We're about to release a major report on how one should appoint DGs. And there what we are suggesting is a reconciliation between a civil service model where people should be appointed through an autonomous merit-based system, but with elements of a patrimonial system. In other words, granting our politicians some degree of discretion in the choice and the selection of public service. So try and attempt to merge those systems. So that phraseology of Yoliswa's of being politically astute, I think is very important. I don't think I want to say anything more, other than that I think we have to recognize that there's a huge opportunity in South Africa at the moment. I think there are very important institutional and historical waves or trends happening on the African continent, which South Africa is now part of, very exciting in a very exciting way. We are having a conference in September, 22nd and the 23rd of September. I think those are the right dates. An extraordinary international conference. The lineup is just magnificent to discuss the implementation of these reforms and the challenges of implementing them, drawing lessons from around the world, our colleagues on the African continent, and from elsewhere in Asia and in Latin America largely. It's an extraordinary lineup. But I do think these are important conversations which we need to have. It's not only a system of catastrophe. It's not only in the Matlanga Commission, although a lot of what we're seeing in the Matlanga Commission is a consequence of what we've been discussing today. There are very, very important reforms in South Africa, and I think we need to give them the attention they deserve.
Thank you, Ivor. I'd like to come in on that as well in terms of this idea of a completely political neutral public service being a bit contentious. Many conversations I have with people, they say, why should I go vote? It doesn't matter which party comes to power, they're all the same. And I think part of that is because the public service doesn't deliver in such a way that we can taste the difference as a citizen. You know, you want to have a public service that is effective at delivering, but at the same time that a citizen can realize who is in power. It must taste different, must feel different, so that citizens can actually make an informed decision on who they're voting for. I'm going to go to the chat for a moment to pick up on a couple of the questions. I'd like to pull together two of the points around a new type of civil servant or a new type of public servant. We speak here about, somebody mentioned here, this need of somebody who understands systems thinking, that really it's more than just about the state and the economy, but also about the healthy planet, systemic inequity, also about building a caring state. And then finally, about how we actually funnel these new candidates into the system. So I'd like to put the question, maybe Yoli can have a first bite at it, this idea of where do we find the candidates that meet these various ideas that you mentioned in your presentations? How do we operationalize recruitment in such a way that we get a mix of different talent, skills, background into the civil service to be able to deliver on the mandate of the government of the day? So Yoliswa, can I turn the mic to you for a moment?
Oh, thank you, Christian. I mean, I think that they are there in the system first and foremost, and I've seen some of them in the system myself. But the challenge is that the institutional cultures currently may not enable them or allow them to be as competent as they can be, to be this type of official that is required. So there's an institutional culture that you have to look at the current public service, because it's a very constrained culture that is really characterized by compliance. And that doesn't go beyond compliance. And one of the critiques when I was a DG at DPSA was that the DPSA is part of the problem in terms of compliance, because you issue regulations and you issue this and you want people to comply. So it's like a chicken and egg situation, in the sense that as the head of department, for instance, I have no authority to review legislation or to review policies. There's a particular process that you follow that takes forever to do that, and you are compelled to continue to implement these policies, and it applies across, not just at DPSA, because DPSA kind of is responsible for a number of things that relate to setting norms and standards for public service. I'm just referring this and making an example. So there is a culture issue that we must deal with, and that culture issue also is linked to the conduct that gets allowed in the public service and the behaviors that get allowed in the public service. But also, some of them are outside, they want to get in, and they are young, and it's difficult for them to get into the system. And the whole idea around what happens when they get in, finally, the kind of training, the kind of preparation, the kind of induction that they get to be able to get there. So it's a whole, you have to look at the entire system, what's happening currently, because if you bring young people to the system as it is currently, yes, they need jobs, and we say young people must be employed, but you are likely to lose them, some of them, into the cultures that are currently in the public service, which may not be as effective and as useful as possible. Or you are likely to lose them because some of them will come in. In fact, it would be interesting to even do a study that see how do we retain younger people who come into the public service. Some of them might just come in and after a short while leave, because they think that this is not a space that I want to be. I'm frustrated here. I'm not supported. There's no opportunities for me to grow, etc. So both ways, you'll find them currently in the system, and there's lots of competent public servants who want to work, but they get constrained by a number of things. Some of them relate to the political administrative interface. Some of them relate to the culture. Well, it's issues that are related to culture, because even the political administrative interface also has to do with the culture in our organizations in the public service.
Thank you, Yoliswa. To bundle two questions, perhaps this time for you, Vino. There's been a comment around, from a fiscal perspective, one of the ways that we're trying to achieve savings is by asking some public servants to take early retirement and leaving their expensive perks and salaries behind. What are we losing as a consequence when these people leave the public service? On the other hand, we also have, and Samantha just posted this article, young teachers that are qualified that can't find jobs, that are not being employed by the state, young doctors that are not being employed by the state because there's no money. So we've got squeezing at the top, squeezing at the bottom. And then finally, we have a lot of people who retire and then become very expensive consultants to the state who do exactly the same job that they did previously, but for more money. So 3 different dynamics. Maybe you can comment on these and how these are managed in a way that actually benefits the public service.
Let me just stick with one of those. So, as I said, 3 different dynamics. I think the one concern, and it's been spoken to, is around replenishment. And why aren't we, if it's the case that there are fiscal constraints which are forcing highly experienced senior managers to exit the system perhaps prematurely or sort of not stay on longer than they should, if there are those genuine constraints, which there probably are, then how do you fill that gap? I think the big issue is, and I speak to my students about this, where's the incentive? There's no incentive for middle managers to aspire to climb the ladder into the senior management ranks. So we've created these we've created CORE, CORPS, right? Well, we say we've created these CORE, the middle management service and the senior management service, but they don't function like CORE. If you look at other countries that have created these specialized cohorts of senior managers, they put in place a clear career trajectory, clear incentives for career progression, which solves the replenishment problem. We haven't done that. And if you don't put the incentives in the system, you're gonna have 2 problems. You're not going to get the replenishment of the senior most officials who are exiting, but you're also not going to signal to younger people that, hey, if I can come into at an entry level, come into the public service with a master's degree and I can realistically aspire to be a middle manager and a senior manager, I need to see that there's a clear pathway for me to do that. And so we need to put those incentives in place to be able to solve both those problems. And I think on the demand side, we need to have a much more ambitious graduate recruitment program. We talk about this. There are internships out there. I think there's a presidential scheme to bring in younger people to get some experience. But it's fairly haphazard and fairly fragmented. I was talking to my students the other week. We were looking at an article which compares talent management. So we looked at Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand. And the interesting thing about that article is that these are carefully crafted, ambitious, targeted interventions to see the future public servants, not just as bodies, but as talent. We've got tons of talent. I've got tons of talent sitting in my class, but they're just not incentivized, and they don't see the realistic prospects for them to get their honors and masters and get into those positions. So we need to solve the incentive problem, but we also need to put in place a more ambitious, coherent graduate recruitment scheme to suck up all of that talent which is there.
Thank you, Vino. That is very helpful.
And I don't know, Christian, if I may just add there, because that special dispensation, actually, we worked on it when I was at DPSA as well. The idea was not to get rid of people who have specialized skills, like in the form of your educators and your people in the healthcare sector, as an example, because the decision ultimately of who gets released was decentralized to the heads of departments, because they would know the skills requirements and the skills capabilities and the skills base in there. But how that managed becomes something else. I don't know how it's managed now, but that was not the intention. And of course, we know the disjuncture between the policy implementation and what gets implemented at the end. So there is that. But the other idea was that as the people are released, you're going to have a program of bringing in new people who fill certain roles. Some of those roles that people are leaving are roles that may not even be required moving into the future, because we need new roles for data people and this and that and that. So I don't know how that is handled, but the thinking around that was that this idea of bringing in new skills, new capabilities, which in most instances are found in younger people, and building incentives around that should have been part of what follows, what goes into the replenishment as the people as the older people are exiting the public service. And the case for them exiting, yes, it was financial, but also there are realities. If you look, for instance, at some of the data in terms of productivity and health reports and etc., some people do want to exit voluntarily, which is why the dispensation is voluntarily. No one can be forced to exit. Some people want to leave because of their health conditions or because they want to explore other things in life, but they don't want to lose in terms of their pension. So that arrangement was also aimed at covering those particular people so that they can leave voluntarily but create space to rejuvenate the public service. I think that was the concept that was used at the time, to rejuvenate both in terms of bringing new skills, bringing in younger people, obviously, because also they get paid at slightly different levels. Because can you imagine a person who has been a director for 20 years, they are paid at the highest level of that portfolio, who's going to enter and grow in the next 10 years into the highest level. So that was the thinking. So I can only speak about what the policy thinking was at the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoliswa. It's very helpful to hear also that it's not necessarily a uniform picture across the entire public service. So I think given the time, we should start tying up. I'd just like to say thank you very much before handing the word to Ivor last time. Thank you very much to the NSI for this very important work, for having found this very important data, Yoliswa making it available for the NSI to study. And I recommend to all the listeners to really have a look at all three of the papers that have come out already and the ones that are coming out that make this very strong argument for why there is such a big opportunity in transforming the South African state right now. So Ivor, perhaps to kick you off for your concluding remarks, who needs to see this information? Who are the role players that most need to understand the opportunity and need to operationalize a new system going forward? So I'll hand over to you if you could do closing remarks to go with that hidden question. Thank you.
Super. Thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation, I have to say, and I think there's lots of very interesting ideas which I'd like to pick up on going forward. But Christian, thank you very much to the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for your ongoing support to the NSI generally, and in particular for this series of reports. Very, very grateful to you and to the German, to the Christian Democratic Party in this regard. Thank you to Yoliswa and to Vino for a very interesting conversation, a very interesting discussion. I mean, there's so much to discuss. This question of the finances and incentives, I think, is hugely important, because what we've definitely seen is that the senior management service, and I think it explains why that cohort in particular is aging and not leaving, is because they're very well paid and they have been essentially capturing the lion's share of departmental budgets. So I think the rethinking the incentive structure to bring it to pay higher salaries at the lower levels, and especially medium levels, middle management levels, might be a way of restructuring these departments and bringing in new people at different levels of the organization. I also think we definitely need to rethink the way in which we recruit public servants. Currently, the system is crazily decentralized. Essentially, it happens at departmental level. I do think we need a re-centralization around. I think it would be a good idea to have a conversation which we had briefly in 1994 and then dropped very quickly around a universal entrance exam. I know that the professionalization framework mooted by the Public Service Commission and the National School of Government have raised the question of a universal entrance exam again for the public service. I think it's a good idea. And much clearer gradations of promotion opportunities to promote, and the conditions one will need to fulfill in order to be promoted. But I definitely think we need to rethink the role of the SMS and the way in which the budgetary system works in essentially favouring them over all other levels. On that note, I think these sorts of conversations are the kind of conversations which we need. For some reason, which is still a mystery to me, in South Africa, when you talk public administration, people's eyes tend to glaze over. And as a result, from a of view, I think there isn't the adequate kind of attention to these sorts of issues, but they are, in my mind, the fundamental issues. We cannot move forward economically or progressively within South Africa if we do not build an effective public administration. And I think this work is to try to contribute to and incentivize the emergence of a more and better quality of those sorts of conversations. On that note, thank you from a very, very exciting discussion. I'd like to say thank you to everyone and to say goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And see you soon.